These are 10 Golden Age stars who did shockingly stupid things that cost them money, careers, or opportunities they never got back. This video walks through those choices one by one and shows how decisions, not talent, shaped the way their stories ended. Stay with it, because some of these mistakes are almost painful to hear about. In the next few minutes, we will move from typecasting and bad contracts to financial disasters and misplaced trust. And each story will feel familiar if you grew up watching these faces on screen. The names are legendary, the errors were very human, and the patterns repeat more than you might expect. Number 10. George Reeves. George Reeves started out as a promising film actor, and that path looked steady until he agreed to play Superman on television for a weekly paycheck of $1,250. That number sounded strong at the time, yet it locked him into a role that viewers could not separate from his real name, which meant casting directors struggled to picture him in anything else. Once the Adventures of Superman series took off, the character became larger than the man, and that is when his decision really started to backfire, because serious film offers quietly dried up while the cape stayed glued to his image. Studios saw Superman before they saw George Reeves, and the result was a career that narrowed instead of expanded. He did not lose his talent, he lost his range in the eyes of the people who hired him, and that came directly from one contract choice that seemed smart in the short term, but incredibly limiting over time. Number 9. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford built her reputation in front of the camera, yet in 1959 she stepped into something very different when she joined the Pepsi-Cola board of directors. A movie star sitting at a corporate table sounded impressive, and that is where the trouble began, because the skills that worked on a film set did not translate well into boardroom strategy. Crawford pushed hard in meetings, argued for directions she did not fully understand, and clashed with executives who expected measured, financially grounded decisions rather than emotional, image-driven instincts. The problem was simple and stubborn. She brought Hollywood-style intensity into a setting that demanded calm analysis. And this is where it gets worse, since those clashes became a recurring pattern over the years. By 1973, her time on the board came to an end, and what looked like a second act as a corporate leader instead highlighted how out of place she was in that environment. She remained an icon on screen, but in business, her decisions showed just how far outside her depth she had wandered. Number 8. Lou Costello from Abbott and Costello earned huge money during his peak years, yet his fortune disappeared for one painfully preventable reason, and that reason had a name: his accountant. In the 1950s, that accountant embezzled nearly $1 million from Costello, and that figure in the money of the time represented years of hard work and success. Costello had handed over complete control of his finances, which meant he did not cross-check statements, did not bring in a second opinion, and did not build any real safeguards around the wealth he created. The result was predictable in hindsight and brutal in reality, as money drained away while he focused on performing, and that is when everything he thought was secure turned out to be gone. Nothing about his stage presence or popularity could save him from that mistake, because the damage came from trust placed in the wrong person without any oversight. The laughs remained famous, but the accounts that should have backed that legacy sat empty. Number 7. Buster Keaton. Buster Keaton stood at the top of silent film comedy, yet in 1928 he chose to sell his independent studio to MGM, a move he later called the worst mistake of my life. Before that sale, he directed, performed, and shaped his own work, and that creative control defined everything audiences loved about him. Once MGM took over, the studio assigned scripts, limited his input, and put him into projects that did not fit his style, and that is when his career momentum began to slide. The problem was not a lack of ability. The problem was that he signed away the freedom that made his work special in the first place, which meant he became one more actor in a massive system instead of a driving creative force. Over time, the situation grew even sadder, and this is where it gets difficult to hear, because eventually he worked as a gag writer, earning $100 per week, a stark contrast to the status he once held. He did not simply lose a studio, he traded independence for security and wound up with neither. Number 6. Frances Farmer. Frances Farmer came into Hollywood with real talent and clear potential, Yet she repeatedly made choices that put her at odds with the very studios that could have built her career. She rejected roles she considered beneath her and argued with executives, which meant she quickly gained a reputation as someone who would not cooperate with the usual expectations of the system. Instead of playing the publicity and politics game, like many of her peers, Farmer pushed back in public and private, and that is when doors quietly began to close, because studios did not want to risk ongoing conflict. What nobody expected was just how thoroughly these clashes would reshape her path, as fewer opportunities came her way, and the momentum she had built early on started to fade. Many of the wildest stories about her life are unverified, yet one part is well documented. Her own behavior made her harder and harder to employ. Her ability was real, but her decisions steadily isolated her from the industry that once believed in her. Number 5, Clara Bow. Clara Bow, known as the It Girl of the 1920s, earned an incredible $35,000 per week at her peak, a figure that showed just how big a draw she had become. Money poured in from film after film, and that is where her mistake began, because she assumed the people around her would handle that income properly while she stayed focused on work. Managers mishandled her finances, others stole from her, and studios took advantage of her lack of involvement with contracts and accounting, which meant large sums slipped away without proper tracking or protection. The result was a slow financial leak rather than a single dramatic collapse. And this is where it gets especially sad, since by the time she left Hollywood, she kept far less than someone with her earnings should have retained. She did not lose everything overnight. She simply never took control, and in the long run, that hands-off approach left her vulnerable to exploitation from nearly every direction. The image of effortless success hit a very different reality once the paycheck stopped. Number 4, John Wayne. John Wayne believed deeply in the Alamo, and his commitment to that film went far beyond acting, since he personally guaranteed large loans and poured his own money into the production. The budget climbed to $12 million, a huge amount for 1960, and that is when the risk turned into real danger for his finances. Wayne refused to cut corners or scale back his vision, which meant the project kept consuming resources long after a more cautious producer might have pulled back. And the result was a film that weighed heavily on him, long after it left theaters. What nobody expected at the start was how close this single passion project came to wiping out the fortune he had built through years of work. He loved the story and wanted to tell it his way, but that decision left him struggling under the financial fallout for years afterward. In this case, dedication and stubbornness blended into a choice that nearly cost him everything. Number 3, Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe became one of the most recognizable faces in film history, yet early in her career she accepted studio contracts that left her dramatically underpaid. The clearest example came with Gentlemen Prefer Blondes in 1953, where Monroe earned $18,000, while her co-star Jane Russell received $100,000. That gap did not come from lack of popularity, it came from earlier agreements that gave Monroe almost no leverage, which meant the studio could benefit from her rising fame without paying her what she truly brought in. Over time, she pushed back against this system and challenged the way studios treated her. And that is when the public started to see her not just as a star, but as someone fighting for control. Even so, the damage from those early contracts could not be undone, because the money and opportunities lost in those years never returned. Her talent remained obvious, yet her own signature on those agreements kept her from earning at the level her name deserved. Number 2, Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi's performance in Dracula in 1931 became iconic, and audiences still picture him when they think of the character. But his choices after that success narrowed his career instead of expanding it. He turned down roles outside of horror, rejected parts that did not match the elegant villain image he preferred, and refused opportunities like playing Frankenstein's monster, which meant he kept himself in a very small professional box. For that legendary turn as Dracula, he received just $3,500, and that number becomes even more striking when you remember how influential the film became over time. As the years passed, the horror roles grew fewer, and this is where it gets harsh, because the combination of limited work and limited pay pushed him into serious financial trouble. When Lugosi died, he had so little money that Frank Sinatra paid for his funeral, a stark final note for someone who shaped an entire genre. He did not simply fall victim to typecasting. He reinforced it through his own decisions until almost nothing else remained. Number 1, Judy Garland. Judy Garland possessed a once-in-a-generation talent, yet she allowed studios and managers to control far too much of her life and finances. And the people around her guided her career, handled her money, and shaped her public image, which meant the person earning the income was rarely the one deciding what happened to it. Across the years, she brought in millions, but when everything finally collapsed, she was left with around $40,000 in assets and about $4 million in debt. And this is where the story turns especially heavy. In 1950, the IRS even seized her home because of unpaid taxes, a moment that showed how severe the mismanagement had become. Garland continued to rely on people who failed her financially, which meant the same patterns repeated instead of being corrected. And the result was a heartbreaking contrast between the size of her gifts and the state of her accounts. Her life did not crumble because of a single bad signature. It fell apart because she never fully took control of the decisions being made in her name. These 10 stories come from a time many viewers remember well, when these faces appeared regularly on theater screens and early television. Every name on this list carried enormous talent, yet their missteps show how quickly money, power, and opportunity can slip away when decisions go wrong. Some were trapped by typecasting, some were drained by bad contracts, and others watched fortunes disappear because they trusted the wrong people or chased risky dreams without safeguards. The result was the same in each case. Success on camera could not protect them from choices that undercut everything they built. Looking back now, their careers still shine, but the mistakes sit right beside the achievements as part of the full picture. These Golden Age stars gave the world unforgettable performances, and they also left behind cautionary tales about what happens when talent is not matched with careful, clear judgment.